Okay, well, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon, this morning, wherever you are, for Beyond Mommy Brain, the Neuroscience of Maternal Instincts, which is our final seminar in Society and Neuroscience of the fall semester. My name is Pamela Smith. I'm the director of the Center for Science and Society, which houses the Presidential Scholars in Society and Neuroscience. And we are very glad to see so many of you here today. There are hundreds of people here today. This speaker series, the Presidential Scholars in Society and Neuroscience program seminars at Columbia bring together interdisciplinary perspectives in mind, brain, and behavior research. For today's event, we have a really brilliant group of speakers who will discuss the science behind maternal instincts. If this is your first Center for Science and Society seminar in Society and Neuroscience seminar, I want to quickly tell you about the Presidential Scholars Program and the Center for Science and Society. The Center for Science and Society, as I said, hosts the Presidential Scholars in Society and Neuroscience program, and this program facilitates cross-disciplinary collaborative research to advance our understanding of mind, brain, and behavior. It brings together talented early career scholars from many fields with faculty experts in neuroscience and in the humanities, arts, and social sciences. The core of our program is our early career postdoctoral scholars who pursue independent research at the intersection of neuroscience, arts, humanities, and the social sciences. Each scholar receives tailored support for their project from at least 2 faculty mentors from different departments who have the relevant knowledge and expertise to help guide their research. And you can see the number of scholars, each of them, a number of mentors each of them has. Current mentors come from neuroscience, sociology, psychology, psychiatry, medical humanities, and ethics, music, and philosophy, English, comparative literature, and many other disciplines. The scholars and PSSN faculty are central in organizing interdisciplinary events, so stay tuned for our announcements about our spring seminars. You may already be aware that the Presidential Scholars Program is also in the spring looking for new scholars. We have 2 interdisciplinary postdoctoral positions available in this application cycle. And consistent with our 2022 vision, priority will be given to applicants that align with the goal of supporting diversity, equity, and inclusion within the program. You can find more information on our website. Please help spread the word if you know of people who will be interested in applying for this really extraordinary opportunity. Also visit our website to register for upcoming events, sign up for our newsletter. You can also connect with us in social media of all kinds. And you can also find, importantly, recordings of previous seminars, both in person and online on our website. For tonight's event, you can participate in the discussion we welcome you to at any time using the Q&A button located at the bottom of the screen. You can also upvote any questions you see in the Q&A submitted by other attendees. We'll answer as many questions as we can at the very end of the event. The PSSN program would not be possible without the support of leadership at Columbia, our valued steering committee members, and faculty from across the university who participate on the advisory committee, mentor our scholars, and volunteer to review and interview applicants. Thanks to all of you who make this program an example of interdisciplinary achievement. If you'd like to join us, just contact us through the website. We will be providing ways to keep in touch in the chat box throughout the event. Now I'd like to introduce our moderator for this afternoon, Presidential Scholar Clare McCormack. Dr. McCormack's research focuses on women's psychological health in pregnancy and the peripartum, and how these experiences are affected by maternal stress and trauma. She received her PhD in public health from the National Drug and Alcohol Research Centre at the University of New South Wales in Sydney, Australia, where she studied alcohol use during pregnancy and infant cognitive development. I will turn it over now to Dr. McCormack.
Thank you, Pamela, for this introduction, and thank you all for being here. I'm very excited to be moderating this seminar today and grateful for our brilliant speakers for joining me and bringing this really important topic to the Presidential Scholars in Society and Neuroscience community. So pregnancy and the postpartum is a developmental period, and not just for the gestating fetus. Sometimes people talk about a mother being born when her baby arrives, as she develops a whole new set of skills to rise to the challenge of taking care of the infant. But what does this involve exactly, and how does it happen? In pregnancy, we might marvel at the seemingly automatic and pre-programmed routine of reproduction that suddenly comes online in response to a cascade of hormonal signals as the body mobilizes to adapt and to support the developing fetus in the womb. But surprisingly little has been known about how the human brain prepares for and adjusts to this new phase of life until recently. Even the question of whether a maternal instinct really exists is up for debate. And the idea implies that there is some kind of mom switch that can be flicked on when the time is right to activate a whole new set of motherly behaviors. But human parenting is a complicated task, and most would argue that even if there are some almost innate mammalian adjustments for new moms, there's also a fair bit of learning on the job. So I'm looking forward to getting into discussing this today. There are many challenges for neuroscientists trying to understand how and in what ways the human brain is shaped by pregnancy. It's only fairly recently that the focus has shifted away from the negative connotations of mommy brain involving forgetfulness and fogginess towards trying to capture the amazing transformations and growth that enables moms to achieve everything that they do. And understanding how these changes happen in the best of circumstances is so important, not just to celebrate the brilliance of mothers, but because it might help us figure out how to best support moms who do not find this transition to be as effortless and joyous as is hoped or promised. And as the neuroscience in this area rapidly takes off, this topic, I think, is such an important one to bring to this group, to an interdisciplinary and public audience like this one today, so that we can work towards translating the implications of this science for many different kinds of moms, and to think critically about the questions that researchers are asking. So now it's with great pleasure I introduce our first speaker, Abigail Tucker. Abigail is the New York Times bestselling author of books including The Lion in the Living Room, named a Best Science Book of 2016 by Library Journal and Forbes. And she's a correspondent for Smithsonian Magazine, and her work has been featured in the Best American Science and Nature Writing. She has twice been a finalist for National Academies of Sciences, Engineering and Medicine's Communication Award. Her most recent book, published this year, Mom Genes, Inside the New Science Behind Our Ancient Maternal Instinct, has been widely praised for its fascinating and engaging insights into the maternal brain. Thank you, Abigail.
Thank you so much for having me here, Dr. McCormack, and also to the Presidential Scholars Program for hosting this event. So any pregnant woman can tell you that the brain isn't an organ that gets mentioned much during OBGYN visits. In labor and delivery wards, it doesn't even show up on the radar, as the nurses are somewhat understandably focused on other body parts. And so it wasn't until midway through my second pregnancy that I became aware that there was such a thing as the science of the maternal brain. For my job as a magazine writer, I was visiting a famous laboratory in Atlanta where scientists use prairie voles as a model to study the neurochemistry of pair bonding, the lasting affiliation between two mates that's so rare in the animal world, and some would argue in the human world as well. As an aside, the lead scientist happened to mention his theory that romantic attachment is built on something much more ancient and universal, the repurposed circuitry of the maternal brain, which gets built inside mothers around the time of birth and causes us to fall in love with our babies. This link, he hypothesized, helps explain so much of what is weird about human courtship, including the obsession with breasts and the desire to call our lovers baby. The notion that the maternal brain was a real thing that could be parsed and peered at and even dissected was old news to him, but a revelation for me. Up until that time, I'd always thought, or perhaps willed myself to believe, that motherhood was an elective lifestyle rather than a biological predicament, a label, not a state, and one hat among many that I sometimes chose to wear, as opposed to my entire head and its contents. But maybe this man was onto something, and motherhood is an unseen and poorly understood cellular level revolution that recasts the female brain. Maybe I wasn't just sleep deprived. Maybe my brain really was up to something quite strange. Maybe pregnant women and new moms don't just look different on the outside. Maybe we see differently too. When I started pursuing this idea, I began by reading classic studies about what happens to lab rats when they become mothers. Virgin lab rats, as the non-moms are called, really don't like rat babies much, and they aren't shy about showing it. They flee from screaming rat pups, appearing profoundly disturbed by the sight of these little fuzzballs. What the virgin rats like is food, especially sweet, gooey foods like Charleston chew, bars, and circus peanuts, although in reality, they will eat pretty much anything. In fact, given half a chance, the virgins will devour the rat pups. They're the ultimate bad babysitters. But right around the time they give birth for the first time, these formerly baby-phobic female rats do a 180. They start choosing babies over candy in lab tests, and even over cocaine. They will exhaust themselves hitting a bar that delivers rat baby after rat baby into their cage, a little bit like a playground slide during rush hour. One brand new rat mom in one of these early experiments hit the pup bar nearly 700 times in the course of a few hours of observation until the scientists simply got bored of observing. I began to grasp that maternal behavior is a story about motive, which was very interesting to me as a journalist. A switch of motive is something unusual and always worth a closer look, especially in the arc of a human life. The term maternal instinct has a lot of potential meanings, but I ended up using it to describe this emerging core pro-baby motive and the accompanying sensitization to infant cues that manifests when a woman becomes a mother. But of course, the aspect of the discipline that most fascinated me was not the study of rat moms, cute as they are, which brings me to Dr. Rutherford, my co-panelist, who focuses on the maternal transformation in people. Dr. Rutherford had the distinct misfortune of being one of the very first scientists I interviewed about what precisely transpires inside the maternal brain, especially during pregnancy. There's so much to tell, and she'll be sharing more with you directly in a minute, but she patiently explained the tools like EEGs and MRIs that researchers use to safely peek inside the skulls of mothers. Scientists can watch how pregnant women's brains respond in distinctly sensitive ways to the sight of baby faces and the sounds of babies crying. There are corresponding changes in brain volume in new mothers, the degree of which may even predict their relationship with their new babies. Dr. Rutherford explained how neuroscientists increasingly see motherhood not as a static state, but as a somewhat volcanic stage of adult development, a bit like adolescence. She even let me sit in on a few of her experiments. And since I was pregnant with my fourth child by that time, I was able to volunteer for a few related studies on my own. I was hooked. Two major questions informed my reporting. The first question was, how are all mothers alike? Because mammalian moms, from manatees to wombats to your best friend, operate on similar neural systems, thought to be conserved toward the core of our brains. And just a footnote here, maternal care is not the default mode throughout the whole animal kingdom. It's a mammal thing. In fish, paternal care is pretty standard, and fish moms are frequently the ones who swim off to sow their wild oats or their free-range seaweed or whatever you want to call it, while dads do the heavy larval lifting. In birds, biparental care is very common, with both parents incubating the egg and feeding the chick. Probably because I had watched so many pro-dad Disney movies with my kids, from Bambi to Lady and the Tramp, I had no idea when I started my research how rare paternal care is in other mammals. Exclusive maternal care likely arises from some of mammals' weirder adaptations, in particular internal gestation and lactation, which puts the burden of protecting and provisioning the infant exclusively on the mother, leaving her holding the diaper bag. In roughly 95% of our mammalian cousins, males contribute nothing at all to the care of young. Humans, quite fortunately, are a rare and notable exception to this rule. Learning about this keystone instinct that unites mammal moms of all stripes and spots, I got curious about some very basic matters, like how a common set of neurotransmitters, including oxytocin and dopamine, helps explain classic phenomena such as mama bear syndrome or maternal aggression. I learned that the formal term is actually lactational aggression because in mammals, at least, it is so closely linked to nursing hormones. In addition to understanding the role of particular neurotransmitters, I was equally curious to know how maternal behaviors persist after the hormones of pregnancy, birth, and lactation have subsided from our systems, and also how they take root without that full initial rush, whether in adoptive moms or moms like me who have C-sections. I visited a lab at NYU where mother rodents were created without any hormones at all, just through prolonged, and it must be said, highly supervised exposure to another female's pups in a cage for about a week. I wondered if these virgin moms might help us explore what happens with human adoptive moms who don't give birth, but who become model mothers, and maybe even how human dads can transform into excellent caregivers. It seems that the ancient maternal kernel exists within the brains of all mammals, and with the right nourishment, it can grow. But as much as I was interested in the motives and brain chemistry that unites parents, I was also fascinated by mom's starkest differences. And thus my second big question was, if mammalian moms from orcas to giraffes are so much alike, why are we human moms also so different from one another? It turns out that human moms, as many new mothers will unhappily report, have precious few fixed action patterns or automatic mothering behaviors, rote motions that we automatically perform without thinking. That user's guide to newborns never does get uploaded in our brains. And there's a staggering variety to our approaches. Using cutesy baby talk or motherese may seem to us like a global default mode, but in fact, in some cultures, mothers rarely speak to their infants. And even if you look at two moms on the very same American block, they're likely to diverge somewhat radically. So, how are our rainbow of maternal responses determined? I got the chance to talk with my co-panelist, Dr. Kim, about some of the powerful influences that shape mothers' brains behind the scenes, making us the unique parents that we are. She has done fascinating work on how factors like living in poverty can modulate the way a mom's brain processes infant stimuli. So she'll be telling us more in a moment, but scientists now think that elements like stress and childhood trauma, health history, age, previous experience with children, and even seemingly random stuff like the infant's activity levels in the womb or a mom's lifelong exposure to certain household toxins may influence how a given mother's brain functions today. I began to understand that every mother is born alongside her child, and that in a way, we are sponges just like babies are, sopping up the cues of our world, remixing our presents and our family's past. But of course, just because we're growing and changing, and yes, occasionally ignorant of the location of our car keys, doesn't mean that moms are stupid or helpless. In fact, one of the great thrills of this reporting project was getting to meet so many young female scientists, a number of whom were pregnant or new mothers themselves, pushing the envelope and burning the midnight oil because they know this research is so vital. People always ask about the most interesting things I learned along the way. There are so many tidbits. I had no idea that female mammals, apparently including humans, make different types of milk for boy babies versus girls, varying the fat content and the chemicals. I had no idea that livestock scientists today are striving to breed animal supermoms, exploiting the still poorly understood genetics of motherhood to maximize their herd's outputs. I had no idea that the cells of my 4 children had, during pregnancy, crossed over the placenta and into my body, where they will permanently remain, integrating with the tissue of my heart and liver and lungs, and likely my brain as well. And that it is thus literally true that your children get inside your head. But as striking and provocative as these details are, it's also so important to keep our eyes on the prize here. Something like 90% of the planet's women become moms at some point, and even in modern America, it's still over 80%. But America's moms aren't doing all that great lately, with postpartum depression skyrocketing to rates double of what our own mother's generation experienced for reasons that nobody quite understands. If we don't learn more about the healthy maternal brain, we can't help these women. Nor can we understand how a catastrophe like the COVID-19 pandemic can alter maternal states of mind. Scientists like Dr. McCormack and Dr. Catherine Monk are now pioneering therapies to aid pregnant women and new mothers here and now, exploring how even simple human gestures of social support may improve women's health. The gift and the burden of this research is the key finding that the environment we collectively create for mothers is likely much more important than any good mom or bad mom gene that any one of us might possess. The maternal brain and the instincts it supports is real and powerful, but we can't take it for granted. Mothers are dynamic, responding to volatile material and social signals. Real mothers are not Stepford robots, programmed to always be good and sweet and elbow deep in homemade sourdough. We can be terrifying, unpredictable, even violent. The same maternal instinct that protects our children can also damage them forever. So it's incumbent on everyone, from doctors to policymakers to moms themselves, to learn more about how women metamorphosize during this final and most fraught phase of human development. Together, we can transform their transformation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Abigail. And I'd now like to introduce our second speaker, Dr. Pilyoung Kim. Dr. Kim is an associate professor in the psychology department at University of Denver. She's also director of the Family and Child Neuroscience Laboratory and co-director of the Brain, Artificial Intelligence and Child Center. She completed a BA of Psychology and English Language and Literature at Korea University, a Master's of Education at Harvard, and an MA and PhD in Developmental Psychology at Cornell University. Dr. Kim works to investigate the role of early experiences on brain development. Current projects supported by the NIH and other agencies focus on studying whether the experience of poverty and exposure to cannabis during pregnancy influence fetal or infant brain development. Her lab also studies whether those factors influence new mothers' transition to parenthood. Thank you, Dr. Kim.
Thank you so much for inviting me, and it's really honored to be here with everybody and also two other great speakers. So yes, I will tell you a little bit about the research that I've been doing along with others, and focusing on some normative changes, briefly explain some normative brain changes during the early postpartum period. As Ms. Tucker mentioned, that how the stress might actually interrupt that normative transition to motherhood in the maternal brain. All right, so Ms. Tucker mentioned a little bit, but I think, people who may have had children before, had a close contact with newborns before, might be actually a little bit surprised how demanding it is to care for newborns. So this is just the example of image, but this mother is recording when she fed her baby. Here it's 3 a.m. and 5 a.m. and 9 a.m. So, motherhood starts like that. Newborns need to be fed 8 to 12 times a day. It's like a 24-hour cycle. So it's not surprising that the new mothers are exhausted. And this is just the beginning, right? Raising a child, if you're lucky, you might be done after 20 years. But if you're not lucky, that might be even longer. But given the amount of the sacrifice of the demands that are related to parenting, I think, if there's anything else in our life that it requires as much sacrifice and demands and not a lot of reward, that I think the human being were more likely to be stopped doing that for a long time ago, right? But it is so interesting that how we seems to be still very willing to spend a lot of time and energy when we have our own baby. And sometimes, we learn plenty about how hard it is, the parenting is when we become parent. But then, still that we sometimes wants to have the second child, right? Like, did we forget everything that how hard it was the first time? But, there's many factors why we decide to have how many children we want to have. But I think one of the really interesting question is that what motivates us to keep being so interested or motivated or really want to care for our children. So the scientists, including myself, have been very interested in that question. So one of the factors that seems to be really important in terms of the right brain areas are responding to the baby and helping us to be motivated to care for baby is the emotional bond that we make with our children. So these are pictures of my two sons. They're actually two different babies, although they look very similar. But that long eye gaze that they make, that smile that they show to us, when we hold them, there's just like very sweet smell that they have, or very, very soft touch of that skin. So that tactile, that audio, that visual image, all of those help to activating many different brain regions, but one of them that I would highlight would be the reward circuitry. So this is the reward circuitry in the brain that also responds to other things that are rewarding, like food or sex or drug. But as Ms. Tucker mentioned earlier, it's so interesting that when we have our own baby, the reward circuitry seems to be very sensitive to response to the things that are related to baby, the cues the baby is actually sent to us, the sight of the baby, the smell of the baby, the sound of the baby. So that seems to be the core structure of how we feel motivated to care for children. And of course, the human parenting is very, very complex. So this is one of the snapshots of the brain regions that are activated when we're responding to baby. But this also highlights the brain regions that are related to emotion regulation. So, we want to regulate our own emotions. Sometimes hearing baby cry is not entirely pleasant, right? So it's very important for us not to be overwhelmed and regulating our emotion. There's a lot of learning and decision-making. We need to be able to process their cues properly. So there's a lot of brain areas that are involved in empathy and theory of mind. So those brain regions in the prefrontal cortex, parietal lobe, temporal lobe, many different brain regions are, along with the reward circuitry, are being activated when we have baby. All right, so one of the first studies that we did, let's see. So the slide is not transitioning, so I'm going to go out and then come back again. All right, so one of the first studies that we did that we were interested in based on the very elegant animal literature that whether we could also see some structural changes during the early few months of postpartum period in human mothers after they have babies. So we imaged the mother's brain twice, first time the first months postpartum, and then again 3 to 4 months postpartum. And we found was actually interesting, there was a structural growth during this first few months period in number of those brain regions that I just highlighted to you that are involved in responding to our own children and parenting. And I would highlight one finding that the structural growth in some part of the reward circuitry that I mentioned to you, like a substantia nigra or other midbrain regions that are important for maternal motivation, that the amount of the growth was actually related to more positive perception of her baby, how many positive words those mothers were describing when her baby, that like adorable and perfect and beautiful. So it seems like at least there's some evidence, the associations between what the mother experienced and the structural growth in her brain. So that was very interesting. And since then, I, along with many other researchers, have been trying to understand the roles of these brain regions. and how they might be related to the maternal behaviors or parenting behaviors during early postpartum period. And one of the aspects of the mother's experience that I've been very interested is that, as I mentioned, parenting is already very stressful in the most supported environment, right? But then there are some mothers who actually are exposed to even higher level of stress, like living in poverty, experiencing trauma, domestic violence. There's kind of, the list actually really goes on. And what happens to, then if the mothers are experiencing extraordinary amount of the stress. And when I look to the non-human animal work, there seems to be some causal influences that we make, is that if we make rat mothers to be experience really high levels of stress, like crowded living or material deprivations, the mothers actually shows more anxious behaviors, more impaired parenting behaviors, also the changes in the brain. So like reduced activations in those reward circuitry that I just mentioned to you. Also structural impairment in medial prefrontal cortex, a critical area for parenting. So encouraged by these animal work, that I was wondering, what if we actually look at the human mothers who are experiencing high levels of stress? What will we see? So that's what the study that I would tell you about. So, and then two circuitries I was particularly very interested in potentially being affected by the stress exposure in human mothers. Is it the maternal motivation that is supported by the reward circuitry, or it's the emotion regulation or emotion information processing areas like the prefrontal cortex or insula and some other regions? So I was very interested in which of those regions might be related to stress. So in this study that we had 53 first-time new mothers, that some of them were living in poverty, they were not, and they were ethnically somewhat diverse, that there's about 40% of Caucasian and 40% of Hispanic mothers. In the stress exposure, so we measured 9 different stressors. One category was socioeconomic risk, like low income, financial stress, food insecurity. We also go to this each of these mothers' homes. So we actually measure their substandard housing quality, noise level, and crowding. And we also measured psychosocial risk. And we wanted to measure that at like different levels, so family levels and the community levels and societal levels. So we had a marital dissatisfaction, violence in the community, and trouble with authority like social services. So there were 9 different stressors, and the mothers on average was reporting 1 to 2 stressors at the time of the study. And this number might be a little bit low in your perception, but if you think about it, experiencing any one of the stressor can be very, very stressful. So in our sample, that there was a mother who were experiencing 3 of the stressors, 4 or actually 8 of the stressors at the same time simultaneously. And the paradigm that the mothers actually were being engaged while they're in the fMRI scanner was that listening to their own baby cry or matched white noise, or control baby cry or match white noise. So I'm gonna play a sample of the control baby cry, and I'm gonna warn you, it might be a little loud, so. Okay, so that was loud. And so that is just a sample of the cry that the mothers were listening while they're inside the scanner. That was 5 seconds, but we actually played 20 seconds of that sound, like 10 times for each baby cry. So it is actually pretty powerful stimuli that we're presenting to activating the brain areas that are involved in parenting. And what we found was that unfortunately, the more stressors that mothers were experiencing, that mothers show more dampened brain response to baby cry sounds. So that was somewhat what we were expecting, because we wanted to see increased brain activations in this region, because previously increased brain activation in these regions have been related to more sensitive parenting. But unfortunately, that we saw that more numbers of the stressors. So on the x-axis, the number of the stressors were being related to lower brain response to infant cry in brain regions that are really important for emotional information processing, like insula and infrafrontal gyrus. And we actually saw the same pattern for the superior temporal gyrus, which is the region that are critically involved in emotional information processing, especially for the auditory cues. So, and then with some other kind of self-reporting data that we think that there is a maybe, reduced attention or more kind of distance that the mothers actually, I think, creating when they're listening to these baby cries. Somewhat also might be adaptive to their environment. They're already experiencing really high levels of stress. So emotionally distancing themselves somewhat to this baby cry might be adaptive for her to managing her own stress. But unfortunately, what we found was that in response to that, when we measured the encoded mother's own interactions with her baby, we found that the lower brain activations in these regions, like in here, was related to lower maternal sensitivity that we coded from her interactions with baby. So perhaps this kind of neural dampened response to baby cry was actually less supportive for her to properly process the baby's cues and also being able to properly respond to the baby, which kind of speaks to why perhaps the really high levels of the stress might be related to the mother, sometimes the difficulties in creating really deep emotional bond with her baby. So since then, and actually before too, what we found was that, even the childhood exposure to stress, like, child abuse and neglect in mothers seem to be related to later her brain response to baby. And especially when it comes to these kind of life environmental stress exposure, seem to be particularly affecting the brain regions that are related to emotion regulation or emotion information processing, less so in the maternal brain regions that are related to parental motivation itself. So the last slide I have is to just briefly sum up that perhaps, the findings suggesting that the perinatal period might be the period the mothers are vulnerable for stress exposure. But perhaps, when the brain is sensitive to experience, the brain will be sensitive to both positive and negative experience. So another way to kind of think about this period is that perhaps, this could be a great period that we can also use that plasticity in maternal brain for positive changes. And we already see during the pregnancy and early postpartum period, mothers are highly motivated for behavioral changes. They use less drug, they're interested in eating healthy, and so on. So hopefully there's more support for mothers that, she can actually empower herself to provide support environment for her own infants. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kim. And now I'd like to introduce our third and final speaker. And before I do, I just want to remind everyone that we're looking forward to a really lively and participatory discussion at the end. So please, if you haven't already, put your questions as they come up in the Q&A at the bottom of the screen. So our final presenter is Dr. Helena Rutherford. Dr. Rutherford is an associate professor at the Yale Child Studies Center and director of the Before and After Baby Lab. She completed a Bachelor of Science, Masters of Science, and PhD in psychology at Bangor University and postdoctoral research at Yale University School of Medicine. Dr. Rutherford's research focuses on understanding the neurobiology of parenting and the development of new approaches to assess parenting in the lab. Dr. Rutherford's additional research interests include emotion perception and regulation, as well as developmental changes that occur during adolescence in sensitivity to reward and stress. Thank you, Dr. Rutherford.
So I'm going to spend the next 15 minutes with you thinking about what I've called the pregnant brain. So really building on what we just heard from the other speakers to really think about some of these neurobiological changes that are happening prenatally. So just as a roadmap then for what I'd like to cover, I want to first of all just give a few anchoring points around how we think about the pregnant brain, and then share some specific data points with you as well. So thinking about structural brain changes in response to pregnancy, but then also thinking about how we could understand individual differences in the pregnant brain as well. I then want to share some exciting directions for this work in terms of thinking about our understanding of prenatal brain changes and what it means in terms of the prediction of caregiving in the postpartum period. And then I'll just wrap up briefly with some comments at the end. I wanted to share 4 anchoring points with you then in terms of this idea around the pregnant brain. The first is to be very transparent in terms of research in humans is really in its own infancy. That over the past 10 years or so, we've really started to get a good handle on what the maternal brain looks like postpartum, but we're really in very early days of understanding what the maternal brain looks like in pregnancy. With that said, though, there's been a huge wealth of research that has looked at this in the context of non-human species, particularly in rodent models, where we've had a really good understanding of neurobiological reorganization that happens both during pregnancy as well as across the postpartum period. So we've been able to leverage our understanding of those animal models to inform some of our human questions. The third anchoring point here is to think about the clinical implications of this work. I think I can speak for everybody on the panel that we're really excited about the theoretical importance of understanding this period of adulthood as a period of development and plasticity for women, but it's also a significant period of vulnerability as well. So how we can leverage our understanding of these neurobiological mechanisms, how they may be present in pregnancy as well as postpartum, to then be able to think about, well, how can we tailor interventions to support women even before baby arrives? And then the final anchoring point, and I think relevant to the audience here today, is to think about the policy implications of this work. If we're evidencing, and I hope that you're going to hear from all of us today, around the neuroplasticity of this key period for women's development, why not have policy implications that are designed to best support women during this period too? And we can think about that postnatally, but I'd also argue that there's room for thought around policy in the prenatal period as well. So I'd like to jump right in then in terms of thinking about some of the neurobiological data points. So I wanted to share one specific study with you that really was very innovative in terms of thinking about and moving the discussion into understanding about how pregnancy in humans may shape the maternal brain. So this was a study from Elsie Hoxheimer and colleagues that were able to leverage our using of magnetic resonance imaging or MRI to look specifically at structural brain change in response to pregnancy. So we're very fortunate to be able to recruit a group of women prior to conception to complete an MRI scan, and then had these women come back at about 2.5 months postpartum to complete a second MRI scan. And they were particularly interested in assessing structural brain changes as they relate to grey matter volume. So this cartoon graphic then shows you and highlights specific areas of change in the brain from pre-pregnancy to post-pregnancy. So the areas highlighted in yellow are areas that are implicated in social cognition, so include the lateral prefrontal cortex, as well as bilateral temporal cortex. And what they saw in these areas highlighted in yellow was a statistically significant decrease in grey matter volume following pregnancy. So there was a decrease in grey matter volume from preconception to postpartum. And at first blush, this might be concerning. You may think, well, why would we see a decrease in volume when we're thinking about development and neuroplasticity? And the argument that has been raised here is that this is actually neuronal pruning. So there's a fine tuning of the brain that's happening here in the preparation for motherhood. So really one of the first studies to be able to show and document that yes, there are structural brain changes that are happening from prior to conception to the postpartum period. And importantly, these structural grey matter changes were also implicated in other aspects of parenting. So these mothers, where they were showing evidence of decreases in grey matter volume, that titrated or was coupled with how they reported their own attachment relationship with their developing child as well. So being able to link brain to behavior is really critical in these types of studies. Importantly, these grey matter volume changes lasted for 2 years postpartum, and then a subset of the women were followed up to 6 years postpartum, and there was persistency in terms of those grey matter volume decreases. So this suggests that there's a lasting impact of pregnancy on the brain that's been observed in mothers. I want to switch gears then to move away from brain structure to think about brain function during pregnancy. And so the main technique that we and others have used to understand the pregnant brain is called electroencephalography, or EEG. And when we look at EEG data, we also look at event-related potentials. So just to have a quick method slide to make sure that we're all on the same page when we see this data later on, when we're recording EEG, we're recording safely and non-invasively brain activity from the surface of the scalp that's being measured by electrodes placed in nets, as you can see in the image here. And so we're looking at EEG in response to specific events. So in our lab, we show photographs of infant faces, or we have mothers listen to infant cries. So very similar to what you heard from Dr. Kim, we can look at with ERPs, as well as we can look at with functional MRI. And what we're interested in once we collected our data is what this looks like in terms of series of ERP waves or waveforms. So our data looks like the graph here. So the horizontal axis is always time in milliseconds, and then the vertical axis is the size of the neural response. And as an ERP researcher, we get very excited about peaks. So I've just circled a couple of peaks in the waveform here. And we're interested in not only the size of those peaks, so how large the amplitude is, but also the timing of those peaks as well. So we're really interested to understand more about the temporal dynamics of parenting and using imaging techniques that allow us to look at those temporal windows. Because we know so much of parenting is very rapid and very intuitive, that having a technique that gives us millisecond resolution is really valuable. So I'm going to be showing you a number of figures that look like this throughout the presentation and describing you what we found. So to launch into this discussion then, a lot of what we have been studying in pregnancy was actually motivated by our findings postnatally. So in order to shadow what we're going to talk about in pregnancy, I'm going to present some postnatal data in tangent with that, so you can see where we're going. So one of the initial questions that we had when we were thinking about in the lab was whether prior reproductive experience is important in terms of understanding the maternal brain. That much of the literature to date has focused on either first-time or primiparous women, or has looked at just mothers in general, so having a mixture of primiparous and multiparous women. We just had a very general question then: does it matter? Do our neural responses to how women perceive infant signals really change as a function of prior reproductive experience or parity? So this study, led by Maddie Pudderson, who is a postgraduate research assistant in our lab and now a grad student at Stanford, what we did here was to look at neural responses to infant faces. So in particular, we were interested in this P300 ERP. So the P300 is implicated in how we attend to visual or auditory information. And importantly, a larger P300 means that we're allocating attention to a greater extent as compared to a smaller P300. So you can already see on the slide that there are differences here as a function of prior reproductive experience, that the P300 peak is different in its amplitude. And so just to walk you through what we found, the dashed line is the P300 generated and measured in primiparous women, and the black solid line is a P300 in multiparous women. So you can see here that the P300 was larger in primiparous women as compared to multiparous women. And we saw this at 2 months postpartum, but we also saw that this effect remained at 8 months postpartum too. So this was really intriguing to us, that prior reproductive experience does matter, but we are curious then about when does this appear? Is this as a function of after delivery, or are these same neural processes starting to unfold in pregnancy? So we asked the same question then of a group of pregnant women in the 3rd trimester. Again, we showed them photographs of infant faces, but we also included adult faces, as well as photographs of houses as non-social stimuli. And I'm going to present the P300 data once more. The black line is for women who are pregnant and already a mother, so our multiparous women. And then the gray line are women who are pregnant with their first child, so our primiparous women. So what you can see here is a striking similarity to what I just presented to you from the postnatal data. In pregnancy, we can see that the P300 was also amplified in women who are pregnant for the first time, so these primiparous women, and this effect is happening in the 3rd trimester of pregnancy, so not dependent upon the child being born. Importantly, we saw this amplified P300 response to infant faces, adult faces, and houses, suggesting that there may be a heightened attentional processing in general to visual information during the prenatal period. But importantly, yes, prior reproductive experience does matter when we think about the pregnant brain, but also the postpartum brain. We also have some clinical interest in the lab too, and one of the areas we've been looking at recently is maternal anxiety. When we've been studying maternal anxiety, we focused on a specific ERP called the late positive potential, or the LPP. So just to draw this out for you then, so the LPP is different to the P300. It's more of what we would call a slow wave. There's not a specific peak here that we're interested in. we show mothers photograph of infant faces, either distressed in expression or neutral in expression. Distressed infant faces show a larger LPP response as compared to those neutral faces, because the LPP is implicated in what we process as being more relevant, more meaningful to us. And so a larger LPP response is consistent with more sustained processing. So we wanted to understand more about this neural response to infant faces and how it might be associated with anxiety. And this is work that was led by Sabrina Malik, who is an undergrad in the lab. And so what we saw here on the graph on the horizontal axis is that LPP to neutral infant faces, and on the vertical axis is levels of maternal anxiety. We saw that higher levels of maternal anxiety was associated with a larger LPP response to neutral infant faces. And we think this might be related to the ambiguity of neutral infant faces, that in the presence of anxiety, these mothers are focusing more at processing these infant faces to a greater extent. In pregnancy, though, we also saw the same findings. So again, high levels of anxiety were associated with a greater LPP response to neutral infant faces. So importantly, then, the impact of anxiety on how mothers were responding to neutral infant faces was present postnatally, but was also present prenatally too, giving us a suggestion that we could start thinking about the perinatal origins of the impact of maternal health on later caregiving behavior. I'd then like to share just a little bit of data then where we can leverage our knowledge of neurobiological mechanisms in pregnancy to start predicting outcomes for the family in the postpartum period. So in this study, we recruited a group of women in the third trimester of pregnancy, again, showing them photographs of infant distress and infant neutral faces, looking at the LPP component once more, and then had them come back at 3 months postpartum to complete a measure of mentalization. So how they think about their child as a psychological agent. And we were able to predict, based on their neural response to infant faces in pregnancy on the vertical axis, the levels of mentalizing at 30 months or postpartum on the horizontal axis there. So yes, we can start looking at these prenatal brain mechanisms and their prediction of postpartum outcomes. Other groups have also been looking at this question. So this is work led by Joanna Dudek, who also used ERPs in pregnancy and was able to show that those neural responses in pregnancy predicted mother-infant bonding in the postpartum period. Similarly, Elizabeth Mulligan and colleagues also evidenced that neural responses to reward in pregnancy also prospectively predicted how mothers are bonding their infant in the postpartum period too. So really exciting work here in terms of that prediction piece. And finally, I know that we're here today to talk about the mummy brain, but I also wanted to just give a shout out for dads too, in thinking about the paternal brain as well. And so this was a study where we included both expectant mothers and expectant fathers to look at neural responses to infant faces once more. So here what you can see in the first panel is neural responses to infant distress in neutral faces in expectant mothers, and that P300 response once more. And you can see there's not that much difference, that they're paying as much attention to infant distress faces as they would be to infant neutral faces. However, expectant fathers look very different. What you can see here is that expectant fathers were paying much more attention, as indexed by that P300 response, to infant distress faces as compared to the infant neutral faces. And indeed, their response to infant distress was significantly higher than the expectant mothers were. So we're starting to see that sex differences in the pregnant brain are present, and we really need to unpack this a little bit more. The final data point that I wanted to share with you was just thinking about how we listen to and respond to infant cries as parents too, and as expectant parents in particular. So this is work that was led by Sarah Peoples, another research assistant in the lab, now a grad student at Texas A&M. And in this study, we had expectant mothers and fathers once more in their third trimester of pregnancy listen to infant cries. So high distress cries as well as low distress cries. And we were really interested in understanding more about the neural processing of infant cries, given their salience, and it's the main communicative bid in those initial postnatal months. So here's the ERP data. So again, we looked at this LPP component to high distress and low distress cries. And surprisingly, though we saw sex differences in how these expectant parents perceived infant faces, we don't see sex differences in how they perceive infant cries. The expectant mothers and fathers are fairly comparable in terms of the neural processing of cries. And this may relate to how salient infant cries are and how clear communicative bid they are to expectant parents at this time of transition. Importantly, though, and to bridge of Dr. Kim's research, we asked parents to tell us how stressed they were during this pregnancy period as well. So they all completed a self-report assessment of perceived levels of stress. And we were able to see that neural responses to infant cries on the vertical axis here was correlated with how stressed they were in pregnancy as reported on the horizontal axis. So we're starting to be able to link these neurobiological responses to how parents are listening to infant cries to the way in which they're feeling psychologically during the prenatal period. So then just to wrap up briefly, I hope I've given you some sense of that we can study the human brain during pregnancy. The work is in its own infancy. But importantly, the neuromarkers of caregiving seem to be there prenatally, and we can leverage our understanding of these neurobiological mechanisms in terms of not only identifying women who may be at risk or may be vulnerable during the transition to parenthood, but also to really start giving some concrete evidence to support policy shifts and policy changes around this critical period of development for women and their children. I also wanted to highlight that expectant fathers have a brain too, and that we should be mindful of the role that they play in the transition to parenthood as well. But we really have a lot of work to do in this area. We're actually asking many more questions than we are answering at this point. So I'll just wrap up there and thank you for your attention, and to thank the families and my lab at the Child Studies Centre, without whom none of this work would be possible. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rutherford, and to all of our speakers for these brilliant presentations. And now I guess I want to open it up to discussion. Firstly, if anyone wants to add questions into the Q&A, we will get to them very soon. To begin with, I just want to invite all the panelists to join in just a sort of general discussion. Feel free to ask questions of each other. And I have plenty of questions, so I'm happy to start. So maybe for Dr. Rutherford, you showed some really interesting data about associations between prenatal neural responses to infant cues and how they're associated with the idea of mentalizing, and mentioned some studies that then looked at associations between those responses and actual observed parenting behaviours. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about those outcomes. Like, what does it look like? Are we talking about dramatic or subtle differences? Or is there potentially different kinds of responses that lead, that help, that are associated with sensitive parenting in some mothers rather than others? And also, what are the individual differences between moms that are important in shaping how they perceive those cues during pregnancy?
Yeah, thank you. Those are great questions. And I think to say from the outset that the individual differences approach, I think, is really the way to move forward in terms of this line of research, that our lab very much thinks about there's not a one-size-fits-all approach with motherhood, that everybody brings a different set of experiences, both prenatally and postnatally in their transition to becoming a parent. And so thinking about individual differences is really valuable here. And I think you can really shape those in a number of different ways. And Ms. Tucker said from the beginning about all the different factors that she was learning about when she was writing the book that shaping the maternal brain. I think that's true here. We're very mechanisms focused in our research. So thinking about this LPP component, for instance, there's a component that we know is really important for attentional processing. And there's been a lot of literature around how we, as parents in transition to parenting, just pay a lot more attention to infant cues than we would do previously. And that there's a lot in infant cues as non-parents that folks pay attention to that are parents. There seems to almost be, some psychoanalysts have described it as a preoccupied state, that really for the parent, there's a significant preoccupation with child relevant cues. So we think about preoccupation as being attention, and using that very cognitive term to start unpacking, what does attention mean for parenthood, and how is that important in terms of understanding parenting behavior. And so that's one of the reasons I think that some of these neuromarkers are really lending themselves to that prediction piece, because attention is so important to aspects of how women bond with their children, but then also in terms of levels of maternal sensitivity, as you allude to, that attention plays a role front and center there. And in terms of thinking about some of Dr. Kim's work around emotion regulation, again, attention as a construct there that's important too. So we've tried to be mechanism focused in that way, and looking at this LPP response gives us an opportunity to do that. Importantly, there's a lot of variability in the size of this LPP response, but likewise, there's a lot of variability in terms of how mothers report bonding with their infants, or how they report on their capacity to mentalize in the postpartum period too. So I think that, again, we need to be thinking about variance here and how we explain that variance. And we're looking at just one neural mechanism. And I think that that's important to remember too, that there is so much more going on in the brain at this time. We haven't even factored in hormonal fluctuations. We haven't kind of factored in other psychosocial factors that Dr. Kim alluded to in her presentation too. So there's a lot to unpack there. But just to even find something we were very excited about, given that there are so many other degrees of freedom here, it really gives us a sense of there's a possibility here to think more mechanistically. Does that help answer the question?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. And I'm actually interested also maybe in Dr. Kim's thoughts. I mean, particularly on this individual differences question. So you talked about how stress exposure is one thing that can affect the way a mother responds to infant cues. But, as we all know, for example, from our different experiences during the COVID pandemic, to take one example, we all have really different responses, even to severe stress. And so what other individual differences or factors do you think might be most important in shaping how new moms perceive infant cues?
Yes, I think, the mothers are just like anybody else's. We're human beings. So I think every experience that we have contributes how we would respond to our infants. But more specifically related to COVID, but also any other kind of stressors during postpartum period. Recently, the analysis that we did, I found really interesting. So I wanted to see there's something that the mothers do that helps them to support their brain response to babies. So one data that I analyzed was the mother's coping strategies. So this is not specific to parenting. This was coping strategies that mothers reported to use generally in any stressful situations, and two different types of coping strategies that we were able to kind of categorize. One is more kind of this active coping strategy, engage with the stressors, like planning, seeking social support, thinking a bit more like a positively, like reframing, versus more kind of this passive coping strategies like venting or avoidance, distractions, and so on. We found that the mothers who are using more this active coping strategies show a greater brain response to infant cries, particularly in those reward motivation areas, compared to the mothers who use more passive coping strategies. So there that I realized, it's really hard to ask mothers to use and change their coping strategies when they're under great circumstances. But the knowledge, I think, can be helpful that there's something that we can tell the mothers or help the mothers to use those a little bit more during the postpartum period. I think using active coping strategy is very actually energy consuming. So I don't think we can just one day just tell the mothers, hey, start using more active coping strategies. I think it really requires a lot of support from the environment to help the mothers to utilize more. But I see that there's some kind of positive associations in terms of her being able to activating those maternal brain and the reward circuitries more. And, psychologically, I can see that in theory, that should give her more this kind of positive or fulfilling feelings when she's interacting with babies. So yeah, I think there's a lot that's related to individual differences, but the one thing that I think a bit positive compared to some negative experiences that we see as well. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And you also talked about how this made an interesting point that even though you saw a dampened emotional response to infant cry being associated with lower maternal sensitivity, and then speculating that might be actually somewhat adaptive for mums who, in the context of severe stress exposure, I thought that was really interesting. I was curious whether there could potentially, there's a need to keep down arousal, but could the reverse a reverse be true at all? Like, is there a trade-off between those who really do sensitively tune in to the crying and provide optimally sensitive care for the infant? Could they themselves be taking on a lot of, additional parenting stress and be more at risk for things like anxiety and depression? So is there like a trade-off here? And maybe another question for all of us, or for the whole group. I guess thinking about social determinants of health, not all people become mothers in ideal sets of circumstances. And some of the research has focused on relatively healthy and advantaged moms. I know Dr. Kim and Rutherford, you're both working to address that too. But how can we apply what is learned from these populations to those who are experiencing, real adversity like poverty? And what are the most important gaps, do we think?
Well, one thing that I thought was really interesting in the research was sort of the importance of kin and social networks living in close proximity to family members, and how that can be leveraged in ways that can actually improve mothers' health on an individual level. And so one interesting thing, it is true that it's a little depressing, the advantages that privileged women have. But one disadvantage that they have is the fact that they tend to live a little bit farther from family members and from that sort of core safety net. And so I think just by kind of letting regular old people in your life, as opposed to your official therapist or even your official OBGYN, that sort of by reaching out and caring for, family members and neighbors, that actually can have sort of almost medicinal effects. I think that's something that people don't really know, like that when you make dinner for a new mom across the street, you're not just filling a caloric need, you're actually kind of providing an emotional signal for her. So I guess I would say that, this is, having if you live in a place where a lot of people, that can have hidden advantages.
I think that's really important, and appreciate you bringing this, kind of big picture perspective to it. And I actually wanted to ask you, so bringing the neuroscience, the neuroscience and communicating these ideas out there, Abigail, maybe from your conversations in writing this book, sometimes when I introduce this area to people, they feel alarmed at the idea that their brain could permanently change during pregnancy and they become moms in ways that are kind of beyond their control, even though they might be really important to help adapt. But what do you think is the most useful take home for moms or people, becoming mothers? Can the neuroscience and understanding the neuroscience actually be reassuring rather than terrifying?
Yeah, I definitely had that sort of horror movie response from people, Invasion of the Body Snatchers or the Brain Snatchers or something like that. And, I find that element of, hidden uncontrollable change to be very interesting. But I also think that kind of what's reassuring is that by understanding and continuing to sort of delve into this field of science, we can sort of seize control as much as any organism can. We can make adaptations to our particular set of circumstances, and then also kind of talk to other people, from neighbors to policymakers, about how we can harness the science to make a difference, which I think is exciting, rather than just kind of like closing your eyes and pretending that none of this stuff exists, which I think can be kind of a tendency, because it's true that it's like looking out the window, and pregnancy is a little bit looking like out the window of a plane that's, at cruising altitude and sort of thinking, what am I doing here? And there's a way that you don't want to think too much. But I do think that, especially when it comes to sort of safeguarding the pregnant brain and planning your life in a way that will maximize the way that your mom brain's gonna work, I think it's important to reckon with these scientific findings that are coming out at a really good clip now.
Yeah, thank you. And would any of the other speakers like to put questions to each other before we open it up?
I'll ask a question. Since I'm the journalist, I've got a tall stack right here. Dr. Rutherford knows. I am rereading, probably for the fourth time with my middle set of kids, the Little House on the Prairie books, which are about sort of domestic life just about 100 or 150 years ago. And I just, marvel at what mothers during that time period went through and how common infant loss was and how much more attention they needed to pay to everything from wolves at the door to the fire in the fireplace to darning the next year's socks or whatever they do. And I guess I'm still, after all this time, amazed that our maternal brain of our cushy 21st century life kind of worked equally well back then. And I'm just sort of wondering, if we look at cultures where conditions are more akin to what, Americans 150 years ago might have experienced, would you expect to see, or have we already seen, clear differences in the way the brain changes and grows? Or is it kind of something where we are, just this really adaptable, weedy species, and our brains are not, you wouldn't expect the kind of material conditions to have that much of an impact on someone's brain?
I can start, and then Dr. Kim, feel free to add as well. I think that there's been very little cross-cultural research in terms of understanding the maternal brain. So there's one paper that springs to mind that Mark Bornstein led, and I think the importance of where I think he was going with that research is it depends in terms of what the infant signals are, and so he very much focused on cry and looking at reactivity to infant cry, and there seems to be some convergence in terms of neural responding to infant cry across cultures. Likewise, in terms of how behaviorally mothers will respond to infant cry, in terms of the way in which they would pick up their infant and hold their infant and soothe their infant, is consistent across cultures that way too. Whether that's true in terms of thinking about mentalization, for instance, that a very psychological construct that, in more adverse parenting situations, you probably don't want to be mentalizing all the time for your child. And actually, it's more about the environment that you're living in. So I think context matters here, and the type of parenting or the aspect of parenting that you're focusing on. That there's going to be some kind of more, I would call them, I don't think basic is the right word, but very salient caregiving mechanisms related to, for instance, reactivity to infant cry, there's a communicative bid there from baby that you need to step in, that may be more universal, and there may be more evolutionary preserved mechanisms around cry responding that way. But I think some of the more kind of psychological aspects of parenting, that we may see differences there. Dr. Kim, I don't know what you would add.
Yeah, that's such a fascinating question. I mean, only wish that we can go back at that time and then scan the mother's brain.
Yeah.
But sometimes I think about it. Why is the modern motherhood is so hard? And I think we have different kind of challenges. Like nowadays, it's a lot more common that we do parenting in isolation. I think it was very, very rare for thousands of years that how the parenting is done, that it's the one mother. Of course, there are exceptions, but one mother being responsible for this newborn who needs care for 24 hours, right? Whereas before, there was a whole village of people, aunts and older siblings, or grandmothers and others were there to kind of share those responsibilities in some ways. And another aspect that I sometimes think about is, again, the expectations for the outcomes. I wonder, back then, it's if my child survived, I did my job. Whereas I think right now there are just so many things that's not under my control that somehow I feel like I'm responsible for, right? That how my child is to be good at everything, and things like that. So I don't know quite sure whether our, brain, which is very conserved, catched up on this modern pattern of parenting. So it ended up creating a lot of anxiety in us that like somehow by myself, all alone, have to meet these unreasonable expectations. I think somewhat contributing because, our brain is always looking out for potential threats. And the mothers are more so for our children. We're hyper vigilant. And then now we have all this thoughts and worries in our head. I feel like it can put different kind of pressure on moms. Maybe we don't worry about like food on the table. Some of those moms, and there's still a lot of other moms I have to worry about, like making ends meet at the end of the day. And those are the moms that I'm also very interested in studying. But again, in the most supportive environment, I feel like it's not like we're completely worry-free. So yeah, that would be very interesting to think about. Mm-hmm.
I know we have a lot of questions actually in the Q&A, which is wonderful. Pamela, do you want to?
Sure. Yeah, I didn't know whether you wanted me to do it, but I will happily do it. And the one that has really risen to the top is from Tabia Cornell, who asked, thank you, this is very important research. I totally second that opinion, by the way. This was a fantastic panel. Okay, her question is, I don't understand how we can be sure that maternal behaviors and experiences are innate, considering that we have no way of conducting experiments with human mothers who have not grown up in a gendered world. As far as I understand, gender impacts women's behavior and expectations of themselves and thereby their mental health, their brains through neuroplasticity and hormone levels, e.g. Sari van Anders' research on the impact of parenting and other gendered activities on hormone levels. This means women and their brains are already highly shaped by decades of gendered life experiences, activities, nutrition, etc. by the time they become pregnant or parents. Do you think your findings would be different if, purely hypothetically, you were able to study pregnant people and new parents who had grown up and lived in a gender-free society? Do you think non-gendered brains, bodies, minds would react differently to the biological changes of pregnancy and motherhood? Okay, who wants to begin?
I would just start a little bit. That's such a great question. I think there's definitely innate components that to a certain degree, there are hormonal changes and priming in the brain that comes during the pregnancy and during early postpartum period, which a very similar mechanism that's shared with all the other mammals, like Ms. Tucker mentioned. However, for example, the question that maternal instinct or parenting instinct is, is related to pregnancy, right? It is not true, right? We also see the kind of enhanced brain response to infant cues in fathers who didn't experience pregnancy or actually foster parents. So the parents who have developed the emotional bond with their foster children, these parents did not go through the pregnancy necessarily for that child, but we see increased oxytocin hormone levels in response to that child, as well as the increased brain response to the child. So I think it's a combination of both, that we do get some help of the kind of innate, kind of programmed changes in our brain and body. But from there on, I think, there could be really wide range whether we kind of end up placed in as a parent. Really depends on the environment and the accumulation of the experience that we had, some non-human animal work kind of suggesting that it can be even like some experiences that like our mothers had or grandmothers had can actually potentially experiencing our behaviors now. So yes, I'll stop there.
Yeah, I would agree with all that Dr. Kim shared. And I think that this is where understanding the psychology of the transition to parenthood is so important, that we need to link our brain measures to our psychological measures too. That I think that the neuro measures are really interesting and are really valuable to get at mechanisms, but then understanding how that's framed then by the psychology is really important here too. So I think that as a field, that's another direction that we need to go in, is we need to start leveraging our really great psychological assessments alongside and in partnership with our neurobiological ones too.
Yeah, it does seem very individual, and I know there's been some really interesting work on like 2-dad households and how those dads' brains sort of rise to the occasion in a really interesting way. And I definitely think that's an area where more work should be done, because it just seems like we're built to kind of accomplish this parenting task in all different kinds of ways.
It's really interesting. Thank you. There's a follow-up to that question, actually, which you sort of answered before when you talked about cross-cultural work. But Katya Vasilaki asks, is there any work on the brain in mothers who were raised in different cultures, e.g., especially matri versus patrilocal cultures? I ask because there's a long line of social science research demonstrating that women make significantly different choices in response to stress and competition in matri versus patri cultures.
Yeah, so the only cross-cultural study that I'm aware of in terms of the maternal brain is that one by Mark Bornstein. Dr. Kim, I don't know if you know of others or anything, Ms. Tucker, you came across in terms of research as well, but I feel that that was one of the first to come out.
I mean, I've seen some interesting work on things like whether or not preference for, I forget what the term is for it, but some cultures, patriarchal cultures, there's this strong son preference that you can see in these, sort of slightly shocking papers on how, at an abortion clinic, it's almost all female fetuses that are aborted. And there's been interesting work on when those families move to America, or cultures that are sort of in the middle in terms of being matri or patri, do those differences persist? And I think I've seen papers that lean both ways and say sometimes they do and sometimes they don't. And so I think that those sort of, how entrenched cultural stuff can be, and whether or not it can last the next generation or the next 3 generations is something that's really fascinating.
Yeah, so definitely the more needs to be done, I think, in terms of that. But we're doing some work comparing, like, the Caucasian mothers versus Latinx mothers. And we see some differences in their brain response to babies. And this is not about the mothers, but I can expect some cultural differences, based on some other works that people are doing. Like, for example, that there's a study that comparing, I believe, between Chinese culture and the Western culture. I think it's one of the countries in the Europe, that they've asked people to think about different words that describing themselves versus their mother. And it was very interesting that in the medial prefrontal cortex, in the Western culture, that we use the medial prefrontal cortex, which is related to mentalizing, more when we're thinking about the words describing ourselves compared to when we're thinking about the words about our mother. But in Chinese culture, there was no differences in terms of the medial prefrontal cortex activations. So, the people were equally using the area when they're mentalizing about themselves, as well as their mother. So, and then this is more kind of, in theory, more collective culture. So people kind of talk about there's more kind of this overlaps between their self-concept and the others. So it will be really fascinating to do that, whether that can be true in mothers as well, when they're thinking about, their babies or perhaps like more older children. that how much there's overlaps, when they're mentalizing themselves versus their children. So I think it will be really fascinating too. Mm-hmm.
There's another lab too where they look at differences in culture-wide differences in infant temperament and how that might shape maternal behaviors as well. And these studies on, I believe they're Dutch moms versus American moms and Dutch babies versus American babies, and how maybe certain things about the culture may lead to certain sort of broad characteristics of those infants that in turn trigger certain maternal behaviors, which I thought was really interesting, or that the mothers are the ones who vice versa, because let's say in America, we live in sort of a high anxiety society with no maternity leave and lots of other problems, that we are creating, that anxious mothers might be across the boards creating certain characteristics in our infants that in turn are then making them harder to soothe, and then that feeds back into our behavior. So I think that there are definitely really interesting people who look at the collectivist versus the individualist cultures, the in different systems of European government versus our own, and how that does have trickle down effects for moms.
Really interesting and so important. We need a study on societies which have a good welfare state and those that don't, in so many ways. I'm going to ask, I think I have time for another question from Eileen Galuli. Are the changes in the maternal brain lasting, or do they time out or lessen over time? And if they dissipate over time, what's the time frame? Have you studied maternal brains years down the road, brains of mothers of 5-year-olds, 10-year-olds? And I'll just add on another question. Does the brain stay changed after miscarriage? There was a recent article in The Guardian that kind of also reflects on this question, which is the response of grandmothers to their grandchildren. So there's a long time frame that you could study in terms of the maternal brain.
So one thing that I thought was really, I think that Dr. Rutherford alluded to these papers that show that they've kind of checked in 2 years and 6 years after the mom's brains were first scanned, and shown that these, the structural changes of pregnancy seem to be enduring. And I can only assume that they would maybe not stay exactly the same, but that they would persist, because we do see these interesting behaviors in grandmothers. But one thing that I still don't have a clear answer on and has fascinated me, maybe one of my co-panelists can enlighten me, is this research on the maternal brain and Alzheimer's disease and the risk for it, and whether or not, there seems to be some push towards using the number of times you've been pregnant, including miscarriage, and how that changes your odds as a woman for getting Alzheimer's. And I thought that that's just another example of why these questions about the maternal brain sort of matter in a permanent way. And it's not just about, the 10 months of pregnancy, it's a lifelong thing. And I wonder, does anybody have the latest on that? I've just been kind of fascinated by that, but it seems like there've been papers both ways showing that, having certain numbers of children is protective or against Alzheimer's, or a risk for it.
Yeah, it is really fascinating. So there have been actually more recently several papers with really large sample showing that also parity, the Dr. Rutherford presented about, but parity may actually also have a long-term impact on brain structure. That parity, so the more children or more pregnancies the woman had, was related to actually fewer brain aging markers. In the middle age, actually older adults. Yes, I know. Kudos for you. Yes. So, and actually, interestingly, because I think now the question is the mechanism, because there was at least one study that I've seen that parity was also related to the male brain aging marker. So the more children that, yeah, exactly. So it seems like it's not entirely related to pregnancy by itself. It's somewhat also related to the experiences of the raising the children. Yes. So yeah, it does seem like there is a long-term impact of parenthood. It's just, I think the science is catching up, understanding the mechanism. Mm-hmm.
Well, there are many more interesting questions in the Q&A. I don't know, Claire, whether you want to answer one more. We're really at time.
Sure. If everyone wants to stay for another minute, is there another burning question we should get to?
Well, there are several that have to do with the infant sex in responses by the parents. And you did talk a little bit about that in terms of patrilocal versus matrilocal cultures. But have you looked at, for example, differences in maternal neural response to male versus female infants, given other evidence for parental gender bias? Then someone else says, does the LPP response change? LPP responses change affected by the infant sex? Anybody want to take that on?
So I can start that we haven't looked at how the LPP response changes towards infant sex from pregnancy to postpartum. That's certainly something with the women that we have followed up that we could look at. But I think it's something that we can definitely tease apart and start looking at in terms of what the infant sex might be bringing to that.
I thought I came across a couple of papers that showed that having a male child was correlated with a slightly higher risk of postpartum depression. And I wasn't totally sure why that was. Maybe, I've read about different problems that nobody really tells you about that are associated with male births. And so I wasn't sure if it was an inflammation thing or the fact that the fetuses are typically larger or what exactly it was. But I did kind of keep a tally of the differences between male and female pregnancies and their implications, particularly for maternal behavior. And I know in chimpanzees, there's been some work on how the mothers of males act slightly differently.
Okay, well, I think we have to leave it there, but thank you all so much. This was just a fascinating panel. Thank you, Claire, for your organization. Thank you, Dr. Rutherford, Ms. Tucker, Dr. Kim. It was just terrific and such important research. So thank you both for tonight and for your research. And thank you to the audience for a really engaged set of questions. That was terrific. And, those of you in the audience, please visit our website. Please, if you have ideas for seminars that you'd like to hear in this series, please let us know. We have a survey form for that on the website, and it's been copied in the chat here. So thank you all. And thank you also to the Center for Science and Society, to Melinda Miller and Joseph Sulik for all of their organization and work on this webinar. So thank you. Have a nice evening. And thank you so much for joining us and for all of your work. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.